Hi everybody, this is Joel Toppin here, and this is going to be video number 7 already on how to create your own VASSAL modules. We've talked quite a bit about game pieces because that's something you're going to spend a lot of time on, especially if you're doing a big module, putting the game pieces in the module. We've showed you how to put the map graphics in. I'm going to show you a little bit more about maps now. And what I'm going to show you here is how to name things on a map, because when we're pushing pieces around, it just says moving from offboard to offboard. How do we get VASSAL to know what areas of the map are what? That's what we're going to show in this particular video. To do that, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the main map folder, and we're going to expand it, and we're going to look at the map boards, and we're going to expand that folder till we get to the main map folder that contains our actual map graphics. If you double click on it, you'll see that we have this particular folder contains the board image that we're working from. So I'll just click cancel for now. If I right click on this particular folder, I have the option to add a hex grid, a rectangular grid, an irregular grid, a multi-zoned grid. These are the 4 ways in which you can create a numbering or a naming system whereby VASSAL will know the areas of the map, and it'll report it accurately whether you're playing via email or on live play. We're not dealing with a hex map here, although I am going to show you how to do that. Probably the simplest way to name your map is using what's called a multi-zoned grid. The hex grid, what that does is it puts an invisible, although you can make it visible, it's usually best to leave it invisible, but a grid behind or on top of rather the underlying graphic image. And then you can have a numbering system that's identical to what's printed on the map graphic, so that and everything will snap to that grid. So when you drop something in a hex, it snaps it to the center of that hex. It can be kind of a frustrating thing to implement, but when you get it right, it's really slick. A rectangular grid does the exact same thing as a hex grid, only rectangular or square shapes. So if you're dealing with a VASSAL module that's got squares for the map or rectangles, and it's a regular shaped grid, in other words, all the squares are identical in size, then that's what you would use. Irregular grid is exactly what it says. It's an irregular grid. You can snap 2 points all over the map. The problem with an irregular grid, it works well in some places, but not always. The problem with a regular grid is you have to implement every snap 2 point. All right, so if you're dealing with an area map and there's maybe hundreds of different spaces in this large area map, it would take a long time to implement in a regular grid, because you'd have to right click and insert every snap 2 point. It's something you might want to experiment with, but if I find that if I'm dealing with an area map, the best way to go is with a multi-zoned grid. So that's what we're going to use here. I'm going to choose to add multi-zone grid. You'll see now I can expand the main map board folder, and there's our multi-zone grid. I can expand that. Underneath it, there's a folder called Zone Highlighters. I don't ever do anything with it. I've never been able to quite figure out what it does. So right-click on the multi-zone grid folder, and you can choose to add a zone. You can add a hex grid within a multi-zone grid. Sometimes you have a hex map, but then there's parts of the map that are area map. In other words, not everything is the hex grid. You might have a general records track or something like that. In that case, you create a multi-zone grid. You add a hex grid on top of that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to add a zone. That's what you're going to most commonly do to name your the different areas of your map. So I'm going to choose to add zone. And I'm going to give it a name. But first, why don't I define the shape that I'm going to do. So I choose define shape. And now this pop-up window shows up, and I've got to scroll around to find where am I going to put this. Let's start with the general records track. This is going to be easy. To define the shape, you simply click anywhere on the map, and you'll create a point, and then we can click somewhere else. There's another point, another point. I can drag this point out. excuse me, you have to right click to add new points. All right, so I can make all these different polygon shapes, and then if I need to delete a point, I just simply select the point by left clicking on it and choose the delete button, and I can get rid of those different points. So if I was actually drawing, if I wanted to draw the borders on something like, say, Andean Abyss, I could use this tool. Once you have a point selected, you just right click beyond it and it'll create new points, so you can just kind of drag them out. It's not the best tool in the world for drawing, and sometimes it can get a little frustrating and tedious, but when it's done, it's really slick. This is the tool that I use to make the different areas on Andean Abyss. It's basically, you're looking at an afternoon's worth of work, but you only have to do it once. In this case, I don't have to be quite so complex, so I'm just going to hit cancel here. I'm going to use the define shape button one more time. This time, I'm going to show you how to make just a square. Real easy. You just left click, hold the button down, and drag, and there you have a rectangle or square. That's the easiest way to draw it. And then if you need to add more shapes to it, you simply right click and it'll add new drag points. So, but that's the shape I want there, and so I'll click OK. And I'm just going to choose to call that 0 because that's what that area of the map is called, 0. And now I add a new zone by right clicking on the multi-zone grid folder. I choose add zone. Yes, this is a tedious task. I'm going to name this one 1, define shape. Scroll down, there's 1, left, hold down the mouse button, release, and there's zone 1, click OK, and OK again. Now, if I go into the map, choose new game, scroll down, there's our game piece that we created on the 3 area. If I drop it into 1, it says APs moves from the off-board space. We haven't named that zone of the map yet, so it's still called off-board. But when I move it into 1, it knew it was called 1. Now if I move it from 1 to 0, it says APs moves from 1 to 0. So we can see how this is going to be working in the VASSAL module. For the out of play box, I would just draw a big box around that, call it out of play, and so forth. This map is really quite easy to do, in fact, because I actually don't have to name every little stoned space. In fact, I just select the entire region. And in fact, I'll show you exactly how I'm going to do this. Choose to close game. Not going to save it. All right, choose the multi-zone grid. Right click, add zone. This one, let's call this one Shiprock. Okay, that's the name of a territory. Choose to define the shape. Now we got to find it on the map. In this particular game, the numbers on the areas, they just meant they represent degrees of difficulty of terrain. So I'm not going to name these. If they had different names, if every space had a different name, like on an ordinary point-to-point map, I would have to select each space and name it individually. Like a map like Paths of Glory, that's what I would do there. But in this case, I just have to draw a big rope around all of these. So I'm just going to draw a big box. Obviously, this obscures a number of things. So to fix that, I'm going to choose this particular drag point. I'm going to move it there. Take this drag point, select it, move it there. At this point, I'm going to right click. So I've got a few more drag points. And I can just kind of do one of these numbers. And I just want to get it around the escape boxes. And that's, I actually don't have to do that, but I'm showing you how to avoid. If I wanted to call these escape and caught, that's how I would do that, is I would just drag around it. In this module, though, it's actually not even necessary for me to do that, so I'm just going to go ahead and enclose them around that. The way this particular module works, I don't have to call this escape, caught. It's not necessary, so I'm just going to drag it around the whole thing. Choose OK. OK. And now if I go into the module, new game, and if I take, say I take the enemy raid counter out and I drop it into here, it says enemy raid created in Shiprock. It already knows that anything I move in here is the Shiprock area. So that's how I would name an area map. It's very, very simple to do. It's just a little time consuming, but again, once you get it done, your users will thank you for. It's worth the extra work to do it. Okay, so that's how you do a multi-zoned grid. I'm just going to go ahead and save my module here and exit it, and we'll show you a little bit about how you would go about doing a hex grid. Because hex grid's kind of a different animal. So I'm going to go ahead and find one here, find a module I've done that has a hex grid on it. Let's see. I do play hex encounter games. I'm just trying to find one that I've actually done, and it's been a while since I've done a. Okay, here we go. Red Winter. That's one. I think that might be worth doing. All right, we'll right-click on Red Winter. I did the original playtest module for this one, so I should be okay with tinkering around with the guts of the module. All right, it's the first time I've opened this particular module in this version of VASSAL, so it's tiling the graphics here for me. Okay, and now we're up. Just waiting for the edit window to appear. There we go. Okay, let's go into the main map folder, expand it, map boards, expand, main map, expand. Now there's our multi-zone grid. Now this is a map that's got some area parts where you're going to want to use zones, but it's also got a hex grid. So you're going to want to use the multi-zone grid, and underneath it you'll see the hex grids at the top, and then you have the different zones, and you see the user has named them all. Okay, for example, Soviet Deadpool. If I double click on this and choose define shape, I can scroll around the map to find where he put that. I think it might be at the top. Ah, right up here. That's where he put the Deadpool. Click OK. All right, so he's got zones in here, but this is the hex grid. Hex grids have two things. There'll be a folder, and then there'll be an item under that folder. The item under is the numbering system, and then the folder itself is the grid. So we're going to double click on the grid to look at its properties. The checkbox here sideways, hex rows go horizontal, that's self-explanatory. The offsets, the hex height and width, that's something you're going to have to tinker with and figure out on your own. I'm going to have this thing show the grid so we can see what it looks like. Right now it's hidden. Ordinarily, you're going to want to leave this unchecked once you have the grid so that it matches the underlying graphic. Then you want to uncheck it. So for now, since we want to look at it, we're going to choose to enable the grid, and we're going to choose to edit it. And we're going to look down here, and there you can see there is our hex grid. You see it doesn't line up perfectly. It almost never will. Okay? It takes a little practice. As long as you're close, you're going to be just fine. So let's just pretend for a second that we never had this on here. What would this look like? So I'm going to go ahead and choose something. If you did this for the first time, the hex grid would almost certainly not match the underlying graphic and not even be remotely close. So here's what you would do. If you choose the Set Grid Shape button, it says click on 3 adjacent points around the edge of any map grid cell. Okay? Click OK. Now you see the underlying graphic went away, so we're going to draw this from scratch. What I do is I try to put the crosshairs on the intersection, the vertice, of 3 points. So I'm going to do one there, and I try to get this as good as I possibly can, because as precise as you are here, it's going to make it easier for you when you go to fine tune it. And I'll do one there. Okay, you can see my grid doesn't line up. And in fact, the farther you go to the bottom, you see how far off it is. You go over to the right, it's just not even close. All right, so what do we do to fix that? Well, if you look at the text down here, it says the arrow keys will move the grid. Moving the grid is not going to fix the problem here, though, because moving the grid, it just moves a grid that doesn't match the size. Okay, so if I moved it so it lined up here, if I scroll back over to the other side, it's not going to line up there either. Best thing to do is get it lined up on this area of the map, and then we fine-tune it on the bottom and on the far right. Okay, so let's start with the bottom. It says if you use the Control plus arrow keys, it'll resize the grid. So I'm going to hold down the Control button and use the arrow keys, and you can see it's shrinking. And it's, by golly, getting closely lined up. All right. I am going to use the move arrow. If I just use the arrow keys, I'm going to move the grid around. So, and if I use the shift plus arrows, it moves it more rapidly. So I'm just going to move it over, so I'm trying to move it so it lines up a little bit more closely. There we go. Okay, now that I have it lined up really well on the left edge, I'm going to use that control button again to shrink it, and I'm going to use the arrow keys to move down, shrink, move down, shrink a couple times, and then move down. I'm just trying to get it to line up as well as possible on the bottom edge. Looking at the top, it doesn't line up on the top now. Okay, I'm just going to line it with the top, shrink. All right, go down to the very bottom. All right, I think I made them too small now, so I'm going to use the control button and the down arrow to make it larger until it lines up. That's pretty close. And looking at the top, actually not too bad. Use the arrow keys to kind of center it. Again, look down at the bottom. Needs to be made a little bit bigger. Top. Okay, that's pretty close on the vertical axes. It looks pretty good. All right, now the horizontal axis is still screwed up though, so I'm going to use the control button and left arrow to kind of smush it together. And we'll scroll way over to the right here so I can see what I'm doing. All right, now it lines up real well here on the right. How's it look on the left? Not bad. Not bad at all. In fact, that looks pretty close to perfect. That's about as close as you're going to get it. Okay, if you want it to be absolutely perfect, you're going to go nuts because it's almost never going to quite be perfect. Okay, but this is pretty darn close here. So I can choose to save that shape, and now it'll implement all the numbers data. Don't mess with these. Okay, what you just did graphically, it put the data in here for the math. Okay, do you want the game pieces to be able to put on an edge of a hex, you can enable the check boxes for if the edges are legal locations or vertices are legal locations. Otherwise, it's going to snap to the center of the hex. In this case, if you want to have a center dot for line of sight, if line of sight is important, you want to have a center dot. You'll want to enable that as well. In this case, though, we don't want to have the grid showing, so we're just going to uncheck the grid, choose OK. And now we go to File and New, just choose Observer. Should have a hex grid where all the pieces snap to the center of the hex. Now how do you do the numbering? Let's go to File, Close. If you double click on grid numbering, this is going to be a self-explanatory window. I don't know how to make this, I don't know how to explain this any better than how it's presented graphically, but basically you're going to, through trial and error, have it so that the identification of each hex on your hex grid that you put in matches the underlying graphic. Okay, and the best way to do this is to tell it to draw the numbering, enable the draw numbering button. And you'll want to go into the hex grid, and you'll want to show the grid when you do this. Okay, and click OK on both of those. It just obscured the OK button. There it is. Okay, choose OK on both of those, and then when you go into File, New Game, show you what this looks like. You'll see that it printed the identification on the map itself. Okay, right now you can see it doesn't line up because I just drew a whole new hex grid. So whatever the designer had in here previously is kind of out of whack. So I would have to adjust this manually. But that's how you do it, is you can actually have this window open and then go into your editor window alongside it and then go in your grid numbering and you make your adjustments and then you go back over here and see how it reflected. And that's essentially how you're going to get your underlying graphic right. Once that's all done, you go into grid numbering, disable draw numbering, and for some reason whenever you tinker around in here, the OK button goes away, so just resize the window and the OK button reappears. And then go to hex grid and choose to disable the show grid button, and then when you click back over the map, all that stuff disappears. So that is how you create a system where the map graphic will tell you can have it so that the places on the map graphic are reported accurately in the chat bar on VASSAL.